Hi, my name is Leslie Gestautas, and today in our London's Calling virtual environment, I'll be talking with you about the things you really need to know about data migration. And right off the bat, I want to give a shout out to Neil Jameson at 8Cloud, who gathered all this information together from our whole team so that I can not only share some of my own experience, but you can benefit from an entire team's experiences on all kinds of different data migration projects. So let's get going. All right, so data migration is a big topic, and a lot of the fine details will vary based on the type of project you're working on, obviously the volume of data, etc. So if you're watching this, you might be preparing for your first data migration experience, or you might have been through it once or twice before, but you're looking to dust off the steps that you took last time. And that's great, you're in the right place. But whether this is the only time that you're ever going to do a migration, or if you're going to end up going through this a few times, the basics are always the same. And today I'll be talking about all of the ways that you can make sure that you get it right and don't take shortcuts. Data migration is really important and it's a vital experience. So we'll be talking a lot about things to watch out for. So what I did was I boiled down the things that I've learned in migration, and the team has also, into what I'm calling the 3 migration commandments. Obviously, there are a lot of points that you want to consider, but we'll go at it from this point of view. So the first is thou shalt practice. The second is thou shalt not work in the dark. And you may wonder what that means, but I'll get to it. And third, thou shalt take thy time to get it right. So let's start with number 1. Thou shalt practice. So when I was a kid, I had the great gift of being, it was a mandatory piano lesson time in my house. And even though I couldn't get out of it, and I tried, I had another way of rebelling, and that was that I didn't really practice. I didn't like to practice. I didn't really see the point. And when I saw other kids doing really well, I just figured things were easy for them, that it came easier to them. And what I didn't know was the value of practice. Of course, I've learned that now as an adult, but practice in this capacity, I'm pointing to breaking down a big job into small and manageable tasks. And that is the ballgame for data migration. The practice that you do at the beginning and the care that you take at the beginning is going to determine how well the rest of the project will go and whether or not everybody will be happy with the final result. So don't be afraid of practice. Let's go on into this. So at its core, data migration is just making a map. You're working from some source of data. It could be another Salesforce database, or it could be any database, or it might not even be a database. It could just be a list or an Excel sheet that someone has on their computer. But regardless, the basics are the same. You're mapping from one table, rows and columns, to a table or object, as we call it, right, in Salesforce, rows and columns. So keep the big picture in mind. It's not rocket science, but it is detailed work. So what you're going to do is you're going to build Excel templates that will help you map from one to the other. And while you're doing this, you're going to go through a lot of review and fine-tuning of the data that you're going to move. So during that process, you're going to want to ask a lot of questions. So let's get into some of the questions that you're going to want to ask about your data. Because you want this data to be shiny and clean and beautiful. The time to clean your data is now. It is the absolute best time. I'm biased, but I think it's the absolute best time to do any kind of data cleansing is before you migrate it. So what you're trying to do here is make sure that your data is going to be valid, accurate, complete, and consistent and uniform. Let's start with valid. Now, I want to make sure that you know that we're not going to be able to cover every single question that you're going to have in data migration, but these are some of the high points that generally apply across the board, regardless of the type of work that you're doing. So when I talk about valid data, what do I mean? Well, you want to make sure, for instance, that the data types that exist in your source data are going to match up with what you want the data types to be, or the receiving end in Salesforce. Now, I'm not going to be able to cover all of the questions that would apply in this situation or throughout data migration, but I want to make sure that we cover the high points that really apply across the board. So back to data types. For instance, if you have number fields that you know are going to receive the data in Salesforce, do those fields really only have numbers in them in your source data? Or also text fields, do those fields only have text? Remember, when you're bringing over text, you're not going to be able to bring images or fun colors or interesting fonts, and you may have some mix and match in your source data. So be sure to check for that. Another item to look at are true and false, or Boolean type fields, whether they're a pick list that say true and false, or perhaps a checkbox that indicates true or false. You want to make sure that all of those values are correct. Another item to look at are field lengths and character limits. Salesforce has character limits depending on the type of field, and you may have too many characters in your source data. So you'll need to go back and think about that. You may want to change the data itself, shorten it, or consider changing where the landing spot is going to be in Salesforce. You might need a text area field or a larger field in order to accommodate the data you want to move. So while you're doing this, you may come across, and this happens a lot, you may find data that's just irrelevant. There may be entire fields that can be deleted from the Excel template that you're making because you just don't need it in Salesforce. And this is a consideration around your data governance. You want to make sure that Salesforce has what you need, but that you don't clutter it with a lot of things that you don't, just to say that you brought it all over. So that's a consideration. And lastly, here when we're talking about data validity, think about data uniqueness. We want our data to be clean, and that includes looking for dupes. This is the time to consider whether or not your source data may have duplicates and to clean that. There are a lot of ways to identify duplicate data. For instance, a lot of contacts or accounts may be easily identified because they only have one unique email address. There are several ways to approach that, and it would really vary according to what's appropriate for the data that you're bringing. But make sure you spend some time to establish that you're not bringing over duplicate data that you have to clean later. Now let's talk about accuracy a little bit more. I was talking about email fields, and of course those have to be in a specific format, and you want to check to make sure there's no spaces in your email fields because that will cause a problem when you try to migrate. Website fields, those need to be in a URL format. And another place that is interesting because there are many different conventions are phone numbers and phone extensions. What is the format that you want to use for your phone numbers? Do you validate that in Salesforce, or is it an open text field where you might use a period between each section of numbers, or perhaps you use a hyphen? Maybe you do or don't include country code in front. And that brings us to another fun spot in Salesforce, and that's address fields. These may need special consideration because if you're migrating to a standard object that uses the compound standard address field in Salesforce, you'll need to accommodate for that and set it up in your Excel sheet so that it will flow the way you want to. If you're using custom fields, then that's also going to change your approach on how you're setting up your template. So as you're learning more and more about your data, now you may see that you may be missing records, or the records may be missing key fields. And one of the things to think about here are required fields that you've indicated in Salesforce. You can't leave those blank. And when you try to migrate information, then you're going to have a problem. So now you need to think about your business process and what you've done with your data in Salesforce and how you're going to have to compensate for that. And another really big thing to think about is the relationship between data elements. Here I'm talking about parent and child relationships and objects in Salesforce. You probably won't have the same relationships in your source organization. And this will take a little extra time to spend, because it will indicate the order that you're going to decide to migrate your data. When we migrate data, we only go object by object. It's not across the board. And so there might be, if you are loading information that would be creating a parent record, then you would need to export that information now that it has a Salesforce ID, add that information to your next template when you're getting ready to load a child object. So that's some extra steps that are going to come in besides just pushing the button and pushing information over into Salesforce. And last, all the basics, cover all of it here, right? Consistency, check spelling, check pick list values. Do they match what you intend to have them say in Salesforce? Big thing that happens in pick list fields is acronyms. So review that for consistency. Here I've noted IT, for instance, versus writing out information technology. Another place where this shows up is acronyms for states, provinces, counties. You want to make sure that all of that comes over in the fashion that you want it to land by the time it gets to Salesforce. And another thing to consider here is that there may be other versions of multiple versions of data that mean the same thing. This is the time to standardize them. For instance, one database might call this car 4-door with the hyphen, or 4-door with 2 words, or a sedan. This is the time to make those decisions. Hey, what do we call this? What have we called it in our existing org? Maybe it's new data, and you need to come up with a naming convention for new data that you're bringing in. All right, so let's assume that you have practiced and practiced, and you have cleaned up your data, and you've set up templates, and you're feeling really good about all the time that you spent. Now, the last part of practice is to start small and always test in a sandbox. We never ever want to put data directly into production that you have not tested in a sandbox. And that might sound like common sense, but it happens. So don't get ahead of yourself. Start by loading a small batch of records into a sandbox first. And when I say small, it's okay to just start with one record that goes into the object that you intend it to land in, and you check every single field. Did it all land the way that you meant to? Did it come across? And is it clean? One of the things that you're going to find as you start practicing your data loads is anything that's going to make the data load fail. Required fields may make your load fail. Validation rules may make your load fail. And that's great. At this point, failure is good. You're still in a learning mode, and you want to continue to note anything that you need to do along the way, and build yourself a little written checklist. Here are the things that I need to check every time. Don't try to keep it in your head. It's not reliable. There's too much in your head anyway. If you're anything like me, you want it written down for yourself or for the rest of your team so that you're all taking similar steps to check every single time. And once you feel comfortable with that, you feel like you've worked out any failures. And by the way, I should note, don't hold off to fix failed records at the end. I've seen that before, where it's like, well, I understand what happened here. 2 or 3 records failed out of, let's say, 2,000. I can just load them later. Best practice is to take a look at why they failed and resolve it early in the process. Don't wait for the end. If you have relationships involved and parent and child records, it can cause a domino effect that can be pretty painful at the end. So be good to yourself and check that at the beginning. So now you're ready to move on to larger data volume, and there's a different question here. How much data are you moving? Is it taking a while for it to actually load? Because every time data loads, then you're going to want to verify that it loaded correctly. And you want to use reporting. You want to just check record counts. I meant to move 200. Did 200 land in my sandbox? And you might want to break up these templates into multiple data loads so that you can track one by one. I did this, I did that. Again, it's not a downside here to not be fancy, to have a written list that you're working down to make sure that one by one, everything is going smoothly. All right, that brings me to commandment number 2, thou shalt not work in the dark. So this little lady is blindfolded and she's having a really good time. And she's swinging the stick around because she knows she's going to get candy and everything's going to be fabulous in the end. That would be an example of a good time to be completely blindfolded. Data migration, you do not want to be blindfolded. And what do I mean by that? I mean, do not forget to create a custom field to store the legacy source ID when you're moving your data. Without that, you are blind. You have no insurance. You can't go back. You can't check the exact record that you meant to move data from. This is very, very important. Now, what some folks do is they also add a checkbox saying, you know, this is from this source of data, which is great. That can be helpful. But don't only rely on that checkbox to say, hey, this record is migrated data. Make sure you've got that source ID. Trust me, you'll feel much better. You'll sleep much better at night, knowing that you can go back and you can check the exact record that you meant to migrate. And consider it's not required, but you could give this ID field the external ID attribute. So it'll be indexed and easy to report on and to help while you're verifying information. So lastly, and you may have caught the theme by now, thou shalt take thy time. Data migration is simple, but not easy. The concept is simple. You're just moving tables and fields and data, but you're going to learn a lot along the way. At the beginning of this project, you are not going to know everything you need to know. By the time you've gone through all of your practice, you will have crafted a nice cheat sheet for yourself to make sure that when it comes time to move data to production, you've covered everything that you can possibly think of. Everyone wants to know how long any project or any major initiative is going to take. But when it comes to data migration, you do not want to be in a hurry. Your data is the lifeblood of your business. And you wouldn't want a doctor to rush your surgery. You can't afford to rush data migration. So that being said, there's some fun things that happen with Excel that I wanted to talk about right here at the end. Excel is your friend. You're going to be using it a lot. It's really the standard tool that everyone uses. But Excel does unexpectedly, unintentionally convert data sometimes in ways that you don't expect. So let me show you what I mean. I'm going to click out of here. And here I've got an example, some pretty basic data. So one of the things that Excel will do is it will take huge numbers that have lots of zeros at the end, and it converts them into, I believe this is scientific notation. So when I click on this box here, you can see up above, this had a whole bunch of zeros after it. So thanks, Excel. It converted it into something that I don't want it to do. Another thing Excel will do is it will take some items and make special characters out of them if it couldn't read them properly. I don't know what these were. I can't remember why it's there. Here's an example of some accents in French and what it did when I tried to move those. Another fun thing is hyphens and bullets and things like that. Here, if I add a hyphen to the front of this and then save it, oh, it broke Excel. It didn't like that either. Another fun thing is leading zeros. So if I have a number, let's say my convention in Salesforce is I have leading zeros for some kind of designation. Well, when I try to save it in Excel, it will automatically convert it and remove those zeros. So obviously a lot of this can be done manually. You convert things to text and such, but there's a couple other cool tricks that will save you some time I'd like to show you. So here I've got a pretend practice set of data. You can see I've got leading zeros here. And I've cleaned this up for myself because what I did was change the format of these cells to text instead of general or number so that it would retain those. But again, while I'm manipulating data, it may pop back. So Excel has a really cool little tool here. What you can do is instead of opening your CSV file the way you normally would and just clicking on it, open up a new Excel sheet and go to the Data tab up here at the top. And from here, I can open up my practice file. And Excel is going to give me another wizard to work with, which is really cool. Now here, if I choose the UTF-8 Unicode, that'll take care of a lot of special characters for me automatically, so I don't have to do more cleaning. But the fun part that I really like here is data type detection. So you can see how the leading zeros are already taken away. That's what Excel thinks I want. But I'm going to say no. Excel, do not detect these data types. And boom, I've got my leading zeros back. So now I can either save this as is, or I can go even further into more Excel advanced techniques and continue to transform data. For the purposes of this session, I won't go there, but I just want to let you know that Excel has these available and that some Googling is worth the time to get, save you some time, especially if you're working with very large volumes of data. So that brings me to the end of my presentation for you, but I do want to point out that Trailhead does have a data management module. It's short, it just has 2 parts, but if you scroll down to the bottom, there are a good amount of resources for you to click into. Salesforce does provide some basic information, particularly on items that should be in a certain order, particularly for standard objects that are helpful. And it does have this great help article here right at the bottom, best practices when you migrate data as well. And I encourage you to take a look at that. There's a lot of great information out there. There's a lot of great blog posts that others have done too in order to support data migration and all those steps. But hang in there, just take your time, do your practice, and by the time you get to the end, you'll be very satisfied with the experience. Thanks, it's been great to join you today, all the way at London's Calling from Oregon.